The marble floor of the Ashbourne Hotel had been buffed that morning until it threw the chandeliers back up at the ceiling like a second upside-down sky, and Eleanor Mercer, 58 years old, in a gray wool coat she had owned for 9 winters, stood in the middle of all that borrowed light and was told very politely that she did not belong in it. "Ma'am." The man behind the front desk did not look up at first. He was arranging a fan of cream-colored cards on the lacquered counter, squaring their edges with 2 fingers, and he let the words sit in the air a moment before he lifted his eyes to her. When he did, she watched something close behind them, a small interior door swinging shut. "Can I help you?" It was not a question. She knew the difference. She had spent 40 years learning the difference between a question and a verdict dressed up to sound like one. "Good morning," Eleanor said. Her voice was low and even, the kind of voice that made people lean in without knowing why. "I'm here to see the hotel." To see it. His mouth made the shape of a smile. His name tag, brass on charcoal, read Vincent Crandall, General Manager, and he wore it the way some men wear a medal they gave themselves. He took in the coat, the flat, sensible shoes, the canvas tote bag on her shoulder, the kind you got free from a public library. He took in her face, and her hair gone silver at the temples, and the absence of anything on her wrists or fingers that caught the light. He completed the arithmetic in under 2 seconds, the way men like him always did, and arrived at a sum that had nothing to do with the woman standing in front of him. "If you're here about the housekeeping posting, deliveries and staff entry are around the side. Marlowe Street, the gray door. You can't miss it." He had already begun to look past her, toward the revolving brass doors and the better-dressed shapes moving through them. "They'll have you fill out the form there." "I'm not here about a posting." "Then I'm afraid I can't help you in the lobby." He said lobby the way another man might say cathedral. "We have an event. The space needs to stay clear for our guests." There were 11 people in that lobby, and 9 of them were doing nothing but standing near a table of champagne flutes nobody had touched yet. Eleanor had counted them on the way in. Counting was a habit she had never broken. Rooms, exits, the number of seconds it took a man to decide who you were. She slid her right hand into her coat pocket, and her fingers found the thing she always carried there, the thing she had carried in one coat or another for 39 years. A key. Brass, worn smooth, threaded onto a length of red ribbon gone the color of old brick. The teeth of it pressed into the soft of her thumb, the way they had pressed into it 10,000 times before, and the cold metal steadied her the way some people are steadied by a cross or a coin or a wedding band they never take off. She did not take the key out. Not yet. The whole story you are about to hear is the story of what happens when she finally does. Because here is what Vincent Crandall did not know on that Tuesday morning, the 14th of April, with the champagne going warm and the marble shining, and his own name pinned to his chest like a small bright threat. He did not know that at 9 o'clock that very morning, 81 minutes before he pointed a 58-year-old woman toward the gray door on Marlowe Street, the company that owned the Ashbourne and 41 other hotels across this country had been bought outright, bought by a single private holding company called Halcyon Atlas, and he did not know, could not have known, would not let himself imagine it even if you'd handed him the documents, that the woman in the 9-year-old coat, the woman he had just sent around back like a sack of linens, was the person who signed the check. He did not know he had just made the last good decision of his career into the worst one. If you have ever walked into a room and watched someone decide who you were before you opened your mouth, if you have ever been pointed toward the back door of a place you had every right to walk through the front of, then stay with me, because this story is for you, and what this woman does with that brass key is going to be worth every second. Settle in. This one takes its time, the way the good ones do. Eleanor looked at Vincent Crandall for a long moment. She did not raise her voice. She had learned, a long time ago and at a great cost, that the loudest thing in any room is a woman who refuses to get loud. "The gray door," she said, "on Marlowe." "That's right." "I know the one," she said, and something in the way she said it, some quiet weight under the words, like a hand laid flat on a table, made him glance up again. But she had already turned, and he saw only the back of the gray coat, and he decided it had been nothing, and he went back to squaring his cream-colored cards. He would remember that glance later. He would remember it for the rest of his life. To understand why a billionaire was standing in that lobby, in a library tote bag, and why she let a man like Vincent Crandall send her to the service entrance instead of simply telling him who she was, you have to go back. Not 40 years, though we'll get there. Just a few months, to a glass-walled office on the 39th floor of a tower on the other side of the river, where a woman who could buy almost anything she wanted had decided, once again, to buy something she had never been able to stop wanting. The office belonged to Eleanor Mercer, and almost nothing in it would have told you so. There were no photographs of her shaking hands with senators, though she had shaken plenty. There was no wall of magazine covers, though she had been on a few of those too. The financial press loved her precisely because she gave them so little, the rare American who had built a fortune past $3 billion and still answered her own phone before 8 in the morning. What the office held instead was a long table, a great deal of light, and on the credenza behind her desk, a single framed photograph the size of a paperback book. It showed a row of young women in white aprons standing on a loading dock, squinting into a sun that had set 40 years ago. If you looked closely, you could pick out which one was Eleanor. She was the one not smiling. She was the one holding a bucket. Renata Diaz, her chief of staff for 11 years, set a leather folder on the long table and did not sit down, because experience had taught her that some conversations went better standing. "It closed," Renata said. 9 a.m. wire confirmed. As of this morning, Halcyon Atlas owns 100% of Ashbourne Hospitality Group, 42 properties, the flagship included. She paused. "Congratulations. You finally bought the place you used to mop." Eleanor did not look up from the document in her hands. "It needs more than mopping now." That was true, and they both knew it. Ashbourne Hospitality Group had spent 30 years being run like an heirloom instead of a business, and by the time it landed on Eleanor's desk, it was a beautiful, half-rotten thing, carrying $410 million in debt, bleeding cash through 19 of its 42 hotels, kept alive by the name on the door and the patience of banks who liked being able to say they did business with the Ashbournes of Beacon Hill. Charles Ashbourne IV, the last of the line to sit at the head of it, had inherited a kingdom and managed it like a man slowly selling off the family silver to pay for the family parties. When Halcyon Atlas came in with an offer that would cover the debt and leave Charles enough to keep his sailboat and his pride, he had taken it with a relief he disguised, badly, as reluctance. Eleanor had bought distressed companies before, 26 of them, by Renata's count, over 22 years. She had a method, and the method was the reason she was about to do a thing that no one in her position needed to do. "I'm going Tuesday morning," Eleanor said, "to the flagship, by myself. The usual." Renata had heard this before and had stopped arguing about it years ago, but she still felt obligated to register the objection for the record. "You own it now. You can walk in the front in a car the length of a yacht, and they'll roll out a carpet." "I know." Eleanor finally set the document down. "That's exactly why I won't." This was the thing about Eleanor Mercer that the financial press never quite captured, because it didn't photograph well and it didn't fit the story they wanted to tell about a self-made woman and her billions. Before she finalized a purchase, and on the first morning she owned a thing outright, she went to see it as a stranger. No suit, no assistant, no car that announced her. She walked in wearing the gray coat and the sensible shoes and the library tote, and she let the place show her what it really was. Because a hotel does not show its true face to its owner. It shows its true face to a tired woman in an old coat who looks like she has nowhere important to be. You learn everything about a house, she liked to say, by how it treats the person it thinks can do nothing for it. She had learned this lesson young. She had learned it in this exact building. In the autumn of 1984, Eleanor Mercer was 16 years old, and she lived with her mother and two younger brothers in 3 rooms on Crawford Street in Roxbury, and she took the bus across the city before dawn to wash dishes and scrub pots in the kitchens of the Ashbourne Hotel for $2.10 an hour. Her mother, Cordelia, cleaned offices at night and pressed other people's church clothes on the weekends, and between the two of them they kept the lights on and the boys in shoes and a little money in a coffee can on top of the refrigerator that was never, ever to be touched. Eleanor was a quiet girl with a long memory and quick hands, and the women in the Ashbourne kitchen took her under their wings the way working women have always looked after the young ones coming up behind them. They taught her how to carry a tray loaded past reason without spilling a drop. They taught her how to be invisible when invisible kept you safe, and how to be useful in a way that made you indispensable, and how to keep your face still while a man who would never learn your name told you to do a thing you'd already finished. Chief among those women was Ruth Daniels, who was 28 then and seemed ancient to a 16-year-old, and who ran the back of the house with a wooden spoon and a heart she pretended not to have. It was Ruth who gave Eleanor the key. It was a small thing, that key. Brass, ordinary, the kind they handed out by the dozen to the back-of-house staff so the early shift could let themselves in before the front doors were unlocked. It opened the gray service door on Marlowe Street, and nothing else in the world. Ruth pressed it into Eleanor's palm her second week and folded the girl's fingers over it. "You let yourself in," Ruth said. "You don't stand out there in the cold waiting on somebody to decide you're allowed inside. You hear me? You let yourself in." Eleanor had threaded it onto a piece of red ribbon from the gift wrap station so she wouldn't lose it down a drain, and she had worn it under her uniform, against her chest, every single shift for 3 years. For 3 years it meant belonging. It was the proof, cold against her skin, that she had a place to be at 5 in the morning, a reason to cross a sleeping city, a door that was hers to open. She did not yet know that one night the same building would teach her exactly how little a key can mean when the people inside have decided you don't count. That night was coming, but not yet. In the autumn of 1984 she was 16, and she had a key, and she let herself in. There is one winter in particular that explains the woman she became, and it is worth telling, because the people who only see the billions never understand where they actually came from. In the January of 1986, the executive chef of the Ashbourne, a temperamental man who ran his kitchen on fear, prepared a 400-plate banquet for a charity gala in the grand ballroom, and at the worst possible moment, trays plated, sauces holding and the dining room filling, he discovered that an entire case of the saffron and cream sauce had turned, gone sour in a walk-in cooler whose compressor had failed in the night. 400 plates and nothing to put on them. The chef went white, then red, and began looking for someone to blame, because that is what fear-built kitchens do. It was Eleanor, 17 years old, scrubbing pots in the corner with her hands raw from the water, who quietly said she'd watched her mother stretch a broken sauce 100 times, and who, without being asked twice, built a replacement from butter and flour and the good stock and the last of the cream, by feel, by memory, at a dead run, enough for 400 plates in under 40 minutes. The gala never knew. The reviews the next day praised the sauce by name. The chef took the credit. Of course he did. He stood in the kitchen afterward accepting the praise of the hotel's manager, and when the manager asked who had saved the night, the chef said "my team" in a way that meant me, and he never once looked at the girl in the corner with the raw hands. One of the older women, furious on Eleanor's behalf, muttered that it wasn't right, that the girl should speak up, that she'd done the whole thing herself. And Eleanor, wringing out a cloth, had said the line that Ruth Daniels would still be repeating about her 40 years later, the line that told you everything about the kind of power she would one day hold. "Let him have the saffron," she said. "I'll have the recipe." She understood at 17 what Vincent Crandall never would at 46, that the credit you grab is borrowed and the skill you keep is yours, and that the people who spend their lives taking the saffron always, eventually, run out of someone to take it from. She did not stay angry. She did not slow down. She put $11 of that week's pay into the coffee can on top of the refrigerator and the rest toward a night school accounting course. And she went back to the pots, and she watched, and she counted, and she learned how a great building actually runs, not from the chandeliers down, but from the walk-in coolers up. That was the apprenticeship that made her. Not business school. A broken compressor and a stolen sauce, and the decision, made at 17 with raw hands, to keep the recipe and let the small men keep the credit. What she made of herself after she stopped being 16 is, in its own way, the least surprising part of this story, because the woman she became was already visible in the girl with the bucket who did not smile. She finished high school at night while she worked. She talked her way into a community college accounting program and paid for it one course at a time. And at 23, with $1,100 she had saved in that same coffee can, she started a company that did the one thing she knew better than anyone. She cleaned. Mercer Services began with 2 women, a borrowed van, and a contract to clean a single dental office on Huntington Avenue. Eleanor did the books at the kitchen table and the floors on her knees, and she made one promise to every client that her competitors thought was foolish. She would treat the smallest account exactly the way she'd want the largest one treated. Within 4 years, she employed 60 people. Within 9, she had the cleaning contracts for half the office towers downtown, and she had learned the secret that would make her rich, that the people who own the buildings rarely understand them, and a person who understands a building from the basement up can buy it from them for less than it's worth, and turn it into something worth more. So she did. She bought her first building at 36, a tired office block she already cleaned, and she fixed what was broken and kept the rents fair and sold it 6 years later for triple. Then she did it again, and the again got larger each time until the cleaning company was a footnote and Halcyon Atlas was a name that made bankers sit up straight. By 58, she was worth, on paper, $3.5 billion, and she owned hotels and office towers and shopping centers and a great deal of land, and she had never once forgotten the temperature of a brass key against a 16-year-old's chest in the dark. That is who walked into the Ashbourne on the morning of April 14th. Not a woman who needed anything from Vincent Crandall. A woman who had come, after 39 years, to see whether the house had changed. It had not, and the reason it had not was standing behind the front desk in a charcoal suit, and he had been standing there, in one form or another, for 9 years. Vincent Crandall had come up through the luxury hotel world the way a certain kind of man always does, not by loving the work, but by loving the appearance of the work, the gleam and the deference and the small daily theater of being bowed to by people he could fire. He had a gift, his superiors had always said, for presentation. What that meant when you watched him for an hour was that he believed a lobby was a stage, and a stage had to be cleared of anyone who did not look like they had paid for a seat. He kept the better-dressed guests at the front, and the rest moving quickly through. He had opinions about which staff should be visible, and he had a particular way of looking at certain people, a flat sorting glance, the kind he had given Eleanor, that decided in under 2 seconds whether you were furniture or threat or simply nothing at all. That morning, before Eleanor ever walked in, Vincent Crandall had already shown his true face twice. The first was to a young man named Marcus Bell, 19 years old, 3 weeks into a job as a bellhop, a boy from Roxbury, with a quick smile and shoes. He kept two clean because they were the only good pair he owned. Marcus had helped an elderly guest carry 4 bags up to the 4th floor and had been tipped a folded 20 for his trouble. And he had made the mistake of pausing on the way back down to answer a tourist's question about where to find a good breakfast. Crandall caught him mid-sentence. "Mr. Bell." The whole lobby could hear it. "Bellmen move. They do not chat. If I see you standing still again, you can do your standing on Marlow Street, permanently. Are we clear?" Marcus said yes, sir, and went back to the cart with his clean shoes and his hot face, and Crandall watched him go with the small, satisfied expression of a man who has just straightened a crooked picture. The second was to Ruth Daniels. Ruth was 71 now, and she still came in 4 mornings a week to run the linen room, because 41 years at one hotel will give a woman a pension that is technically enough to live on and emotionally not enough to fill a day, and because the laundry was hers in a way that no manager could ever take from her, even when they pretended they could. That morning, Crandall had found her sitting for 90 seconds on a stool with a cup of tea in her own linen room, resting a knee that had been replaced 2 years before and never quite forgiven her for it. "We don't pay you to sit, Ruth," he'd said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse, the casual way of a man who had decided long ago that a woman like Ruth was a fixture rather than a person. "If the knee's that bad, maybe it's time we talked about whether you can still do the job." Ruth had stood up. She had been standing up for men like Vincent Crandall her whole life, but she had filed his words away in the long, patient ledger that working women keep, the ledger that men like him never imagine exists, the one that gets balanced exactly once and all at once when they least expect it. Ruth did not know that morning that the balancing was 40 minutes away. She did not know that the girl she had handed a brass key to in 1985 was about to walk through the front doors of the Ashbourne for the first time in her life, through the front this time because she had earned the front 100 times over and had stopped explaining herself to anyone. She only knew that her knee hurt, and that the man in the charcoal suit had made her feel, at 71, like a thing that might soon be thrown out. So when Eleanor Mercer came through the revolving brass doors at 10:40 that morning, she was not walking into a hotel. She was walking into a small, perfectly preserved museum of everything that had been done to her at 16, staffed by a man who had never once imagined that the woman in the gray coat could be anything other than someone he was entitled to dismiss. The chandeliers threw their light. The champagne went warm, and Eleanor stood on the marble with her hand around a brass key in her pocket and let Vincent Crandall show her, in his own words, exactly who he was. She could have ended it in that first 30 seconds. One sentence, "I own this building," and the whole edifice of his certainty would have come down on his head. But Eleanor Mercer had not built what she built by playing her best card the moment she sat down at the table. She had a method, and the method, today, was the same one it had been at 16. Watch, count, and let the house show you its true face. So she did the hardest thing a powerful person can do. She let a small man believe he had power over her, and she watched what he chose to do with it. So she went around back. She walked out through the revolving doors she had every legal right to keep standing in, and she turned left onto Marlow Street, and she felt the April wind come off the river and find the gap at her collar the way it had found it 40 years before. The side of the Ashbourne was less grand than its face. Here, the limestone gave way to service brick, and the awnings disappeared, and halfway down the block, set into the wall behind 2 dented dumpsters and a stack of broken-down boxes, was a gray steel door with a small sign bolted above it. Staff and deliveries only. All visitors report to security. Eleanor stood in front of that door, and for a moment she was not 58. She was 18, and it was the second week of March in 1987, and it was raining the kind of rain that comes sideways. She had stayed 40 minutes past the end of her shift to finish a banquet cleanup that wasn't hers to finish, because the woman whose job it was had a sick baby at home, and Eleanor had said, "Go, I've got it." And as she was leaving, the night manager, a thin, sour man named Halloran, who wore his keys on his belt like a jailer, had stopped her at this same gray door and accused her of stealing a silver serving fork from the banquet set. He had not asked. He had announced it, loud enough for the kitchen to hear, with the small, bright satisfaction of a man who had found someone safe to be cruel to. Eleanor had emptied her bag onto the wet concrete to show him there was nothing. There was nothing. The fork turned up 2 days later behind a steam tray, exactly where a tired banquet server had knocked it. But Halloran did not apologize, because men like Halloran did not apologize to girls like Eleanor, and he did not give her back the shifts he'd cut, and the message was received, clear as the rain. This far and no farther. This is where people like you stand. Outside, in the weather, proving you are not what we have already decided you are. She had walked to the bus stop that night with her uniform soaked through and the brass key cold against her chest, and she had made herself a promise that she had never spoken aloud to a single living soul. She would not tell it to you now, either. You will see it kept. A voice brought her back to April. "You here for the housekeeping interview?" A young man in a security blazer had cracked the gray door and was looking at her with the bored, pre-sorted expression that Crandall trained into all them. His tag read, T.O.D. Behind him she could see the back hallway, the same scuffed linoleum, the same green walls, the same hum of the same kind of machinery, as though the front of the hotel lived in this century and the back of it had been left behind in another. "I'm here to see the hotel," Eleanor said again, evenly. Todd's radio crackled, and Crandall's voice came through it, thin and tinny and unmistakable. He had watched her go on the camera. Of course he had. "Todd, the woman in the gray coat. Get her name on the visitor sheet and have her wait in the back vestibule. Mr. Ashbourne's people don't want anyone wandering during the event." A pause. And then, lower, the part he didn't think mattered enough to keep off the channel. "And keep an eye on the silver. Keep an eye on the silver." Eleanor heard it. Todd heard it too, and at least had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable before he held out a clipboard with a chewed pen tied to it by a string. "Name, and who you're here to see," he said. "You can wait on the bench." The bench was a steel thing bolted to the cinder block, the kind they put in places where no one is meant to stay long. There was a vending machine that hummed, and a poster about hand-washing curling off the wall, and a smell of industrial detergent and old coffee that went straight past 40 years and put her, for one disorienting second, right back inside her own teenage body. She sat. A 58-year-old woman who owned this building, and 41 others sat on a steel bench by the dumpsters because a man she now employed had told her to, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited, and she watched. This is the part that the people who would later hear this story found hardest to believe. She sat there at all. That a woman with that much power would absorb that much insult without a word. But Eleanor understood something about power that Vincent Crandall never would. Power that has to announce itself is not power. It is anxiety wearing power's clothes. Real power can afford to wait. Real power can afford to be underestimated, because being underestimated is simply information freely given by people who have just told you everything you need to know about them. She was not being humiliated, she was being shown, and she had learned, on a rainy night in 1987, to keep her face still and let the showing finish. While she waited, the back hallway gave her its lessons one by one. A line cook came through balancing a tray and apologized to her for being in her way, the only person all morning to treat her like a person, and she made a note of his name on the tag of his jacket. Deshawn. The way she made notes of everything. A supplier argued with a receiving clerk about a short pallet of bottled water, and she learned that the hotel was being billed for 40 cases a week it never received, a small theft that told her the back of the house had stopped being watched by anyone who cared. And then, worst of all, she watched young Marcus Bell come through the gray door with a guest's lost umbrella, and watched Crandall materialize in the hallway as if cruelty had summoned him, and heard the second act of the morning small theater. "I told you to move," Crandall said. "And here you are, in the back, where I can't see you, with hotel property in your hands." He was not really angry. That was the terrible part. He was performing anger for the pleasure of it, the way some men kick a thing simply because it cannot kick back. "Empty your pockets." "Sir, it's a guest's umbrella. She's in 412. I was bringing it up." "Empty your pockets, Mr. Bell, or pick up your check." And Marcus Bell, 19 years old, in his too clean shoes, in front of a strange woman on a bench whose face he did not recognize and would never forget, turned his pockets inside out onto the gray concrete to prove he was not what a man in a charcoal suit had already decided he was. A folded $20 bill, his tip, his honest tip, fell out and rolled, and Crandall looked at it as though it confirmed something. Eleanor sat very still, and under her gray coat, in the pocket where her hand had returned, her fingers closed around the brass key on its red ribbon, and very slowly, while Crandall savored his small conquest, she drew it out. She stood. She crossed to the gray service door, the one Todd had let her in through, and before anyone could stop her, she fit the worn brass key into the old service lock, the way she had 10,000 mornings before, and she turned it. The bolt slid back with the same soft, heavy thunk it had made in 1985. They had never changed the lock. In 39 years, through 3 owners and 4 renovations, and the long, slow ruin of the Ashbourne family fortune, no one had ever bothered to change the lock on the door that only the help came through. And as the bolt slid home under a key that should not have worked and did, Eleanor Mercer understood, with a cold clarity that settled over her like the river wind, that nothing else had been changed either. Not the lock, not the hallway, not the man who decided who stood inside and who stood out in the weather, not one single thing except her. Crandall, 20 feet away, turned at the sound. He saw the strange woman in the gray coat with her hand on his service door and a key he did not recognize, and his face began to rearrange itself into a question. He had no idea he had just heard the first sound of his own undoing. It was a small sound, a soft, heavy thunk in a back hallway. But some doors, once they open, do not close again. "Where did you get that key?" Crandall crossed the hallway fast, his polished shoes loud on the old linoleum, and he was no longer performing boredom. There was something underneath the contempt now, something that any animal would recognize, the first cold trickle of "I do not understand what is happening, and I do not like it." He pointed at the brass key still seated in the lock. "That is hotel property. That door is alarmed. Did you steal that? Todd, call it in." "I didn't steal it," Eleanor said quietly. She withdrew the key and let it hang from its red ribbon against her palm, in plain view, and she did not raise her voice, and the calm of her was somehow more alarming to him than shouting would have been. "It was given to me." "Given to you." He laughed, but it came out wrong, a half-beat too late. "By whom?" "Lady, I don't know what you think is going on here, but you walked in off the street. You've been told twice this is private, and now you're letting yourself into a secured area with a key you can't account for. That's trespassing. That's theft of access." He turned to Todd, gathering himself back into the man who gave orders. "I want her out. Front of the building, not the back. I don't want her loitering by the loading dock. And I want an incident report on my desk before lunch." It was at that moment that the third figure in this story arrived, drawn by the noise the way the comfortable are always drawn to a disturbance they assume will entertain them. Charles Ashbourne IV was 51 years old and dressed like a yacht advertisement in a navy blazer with brass buttons that matched, more or less, the buttons on the doors of the hotel his family had owned for 101 years and had, as of 9 o'clock that morning, owned no longer. He did not yet feel the difference. A man does not feel a thing like that in his body until much later. He had come down to the service hallway looking for Crandall because there was, in fact, a small event upstairs, a farewell luncheon the longtime staff had quietly organized, half affection and half funeral for the end of the Ashbourne name over the door, and Charles, who had spent the morning being toasted, was pleasantly drunk on sherry and self-regard. "What's all this?" he said, smiling, taking in the scene. The security guard, the agitated manager, the plain woman by the dumpsters with a key on a ribbon. He looked at Eleanor the way you look at a piece of furniture that has been left in an inconvenient spot. "Vincent? Problem?" "Nothing, Mr. Ashbourne. A trespasser. Handling it." "Good man." And then Charles Ashbourne, secure in the warmth of his sherry and his century, said the thing that he would replay in his own head for years afterward, alone, at 3 in the morning. He looked at Eleanor, and he said, almost kindly, the way a man is kind to a dog, "You'll want to be moving along, dear. This isn't really a day for visitors. We're celebrating. End of an era." He gestured vaguely at the brick and the dumpsters and the gray door, taking in the whole back of the house as though it were a stage set he was striking. "Vincent's going to make this place sparkle for the new people. Aren't you, Vincent? Out with the old." "Out with the old," Crandall agreed. And then, because he believed the only ears that mattered belonged to a former owner with no power left and a strange woman with none to begin with, Vincent Crandall told the truth about himself. He had been waiting weeks to say it to someone who could appreciate it. The hotel had been bought by some faceless investment outfit, some holding company called Halcyon something, and Crandall had read the room exactly wrong, and he was certain that what a cold-eyed investment company would want was efficiency, modernization, a fresh image, and he had a plan ready to hand them. "First thing, I clean house," he said, warming to it, lowering his voice but not nearly enough. "We've got dead weight back here that's been collecting paychecks since the Reagan administration. That laundry woman, Ruth, she can barely stand, she's a liability, frankly a lawsuit waiting to happen, and she's costing us a senior wage to fold towels a teenager could fold for half. The new people will want her gone. And these kids they keep hiring out of the neighborhood as a favor to somebody. The Bell kid, the rest of them, they don't fit the brand. You walk into a 5-star lobby, you want to see a certain kind of face, a certain kind of polish. I'll bring in fresh staff, the right look, get the average wage down, and I'll have this place looking aspirational again inside 90 days. He smiled at Charles. "The new owners are going to love me." The hallway was very quiet. Ruth Daniels had been standing in the doorway of her linen room for the last 30 seconds. No one had noticed her. The old learned to arrive without sound. She had heard the part about the laundry woman who could barely stand, the senior wage, the lawsuit waiting to happen. She had heard the word liability used about 41 years of her life, and her hand had risen to her chest and stayed there, pressed flat, the way you hold a wound closed. And Eleanor Mercer, who owned the company called Halcyon something, who was the cold-eyed investor Crandall was so sure would love him, stood by the dumpsters and listened to a man explain in detail his plan to do to Ruth and to Marcus and to a whole back hallway full of people exactly what had been done to her on a rainy night in 1987. Out with the old. A certain kind of face. This far and no farther. I want to stop here for just a moment, because if you have been listening to this and feeling something tighten in your chest, if you have ever been the certain kind of face that someone decided didn't belong, or watched it happen to someone you love and been unable to stop it, then do something for me before we go on. In the comments, type one word. Just one. Type the word dignity, because what happens in the next 60 seconds is going to be about exactly that, and I want to know how many of you are in this room with me when it does. Type it now and then stay, because the woman in the gray coat is about to stop listening and start speaking, and you are going to want to be here for the first word she says. She did not feel afraid. That surprised her a little. She had expected somewhere to feel 18 again. To feel the rain and the soaked uniform and the cold key and the helplessness of a girl emptying her bag onto wet concrete to prove a fork she'd never touched. She reached for that girl, the way you reach for a hand in the dark. But the girl was not afraid anymore. The girl had grown up and built something and come back, and what Eleanor felt instead, rising slow and steady from somewhere very deep, was not fear at all. It was the cold, clean, settled feeling of a debt being called in. Not her debt. Theirs. She turned the brass key over once in her fingers. Then she put it back in her pocket, because she would not need it to open anything else today. And she said, to no one and to everyone, in a voice that was not loud and did not need to be, "Ruth, come here, where I can see you." And from the doorway of the linen room, in a whisper that 41 years had worn down to almost nothing, the old woman said a name that Vincent Crandall did not understand, and would spend the rest of his life wishing he had. Nell? For a moment no one moved. Crandall looked from the old laundry woman to the strange woman in the gray coat and back, and his eyes did the thing a face does when it is being handed information it has no place to put. "You two know each other," he said. "Of course you do." He seized on it, relieved, rebuilding his story. "So she is somebody's relative, come around looking for a handout. Ruth, is this your—" "Be quiet, Vincent." Ruth Daniels said it without looking at him, and there was something in those 3 words, the authority of 41 years, the flat finality of an old woman who has decided she is done being careful, that stopped him cold. She was already crossing the hallway, both hands out now, her bad knee forgotten, her eyes wet and fixed on Eleanor's face as though she were reading a letter she had given up on ever receiving. "Lord, Lord, look at you. I'd have known you in the dark. I'd have known you with my eyes shut." She took Eleanor's hands in her own, and they were both shaking a little, and the years folded up between them like a map. Little Nell Mercer, from Crawford Street. "Look at you." "Hello, Ruth," Eleanor said, and her voice was not quite steady, and she did not try to make it so. "I came back." "You came back." Ruth laughed, a wet, broken laugh, and then her eye fell on the thing still hanging from Eleanor's other hand, the brass key on its faded red ribbon, the ribbon gone the color of old brick, and her hand flew to her mouth. Because she knew that ribbon. She had cut it herself, off a roll at the gift wrap station in the winter of 1985, and tied it through the hole of a service key and folded it into the palm of a frightened 16-year-old and told her, "You let yourself in. You don't wait out there in the cold for somebody to decide you're allowed." She had forgotten she'd ever done it. The young do 1,000 small kindnesses and forget them. It is the people they were kind to who carry them, sometimes for 40 years, on a piece of ribbon against the heart. "You kept it," Ruth whispered. "All this time, you kept it. I never gave it back." Eleanor closed Ruth's fingers around the key the way Ruth had once closed hers. "I told myself I'd return it the day this place treated the person who came in that door the way you treated me. I've been waiting a long time, Ruth." She looked up, and her eyes moved past the old woman, past Charles Ashbourne frozen with his sherry, and landed on Vincent Crandall. "I'm still waiting." This was the threshold. You could feel it cross the hallway like a change in air pressure. The other staff had begun to gather. They always know somehow when the weather is about to turn. And John A. Y. Dai Chao. stood in his doorway, and Marcus Bell stood with his pockets still half inside out, and Todd, the security guard, had quietly let his hand fall away from his radio. They did not yet know what they were watching, but they knew it was something. They knew the plain woman by the dumpsters was not what they had been told she was, and the not knowing of what she was instead held the whole hallway in its grip. Crandall felt the floor tilting under his certainty, and he did what frightened men in charge always do. He doubled down. "This is very touching," he said, and his voice had climbed half an octave. "It really is. But it doesn't change anything. Whoever you used to be, whatever sob story we're doing here, you are currently trespassing in a secured area, and I have a hotel to run and a luncheon upstairs, and I do not have time for a—" He searched for the word that would put her back in her box. "For a reunion. Todd. The lady is leaving. Now." Eleanor took out her phone. She did it without hurry, the way she did everything, and she did not dial. The call was already 3 taps deep before any of them registered she was making it. And she lifted it to her ear and waited 2 rings, and the whole hallway waited with her, and when the line connected she said only 4 sentences in that same low, even voice, and every word of them was a stone dropped into very still water. "Renata, it's me. Bring the Ashbourne file to the flagship. I'm in the service hallway off Marlowe." A pause. "Yes, that one. Bring all of it." She lowered the phone. She looked at Vincent Crandall, who had 30 seconds left in the version of his life where he still believed he understood the room, and she gave him one last chance to be a different kind of man than he had spent the whole morning proving himself to be. She gave it to him not because she owed him anything, but because she had promised herself on a rainy night, long ago, that if the day ever came, she would not become the thing that had been done to her. She would give them the chance she had never been given. She would simply not be surprised when they refused it. "Mr. Crandall?" "Shakarduriachur." Sound. "A young woman walked into your hotel this morning in an old coat. You decided in 2 seconds that she was no one. You sent her to the service entrance. You told your guard to keep an eye on the silver. She let that sit. I'm going to ask you one question, and the rest of your career depends on how you answer it, not the question you think." She took 1 step toward him. "If you'd known who I was the second I came through those doors, if I'd worn a different coat, arrived in a different car, had a different name, and a different face, would you have sent me around back? That's not—" He stopped. He understood dimly that there was no safe answer, and the understanding made him reckless. "Look, I run a luxury property. I make judgment calls about presentation 100 times a day. That is my job. If you don't like how it looks when the help comes in the front door, then maybe you shouldn't dress like the help." The hallway exhaled. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly. "That's the answer I needed." And the way she said thank you, gentle, almost sorrowful, the way you thank a man for confirming a thing you'd hoped against hope wasn't true, frightened him more than any threat could have. He had just told the new owner of the Ashbourne in front of 40 witnesses that respect in her hotel was a privilege reserved for people who dressed expensively enough to deserve it. He had said it proudly. He had said it as though it were a credential. He still did not know who she was, but Charles Ashbourne, somewhere in the fog of his sherry, had begun to do arithmetic of his own. Halcyon. The Ashbourne file. Renata. He had signed papers across a table from a woman named Renata Diaz not 3 weeks ago, and Renata Diaz worked for— He set his glass down on the lid of a dumpster. Very, very carefully. The way you set down something when your hands have stopped being entirely reliable. And he said, in a voice gone suddenly small and far away, "Vincent, I think you should stop talking now. With respect, Mr. Ashbourne, I don't take direction from—" Vincent! Charles Ashbourne IV had gone the color of the gray door. "I don't think you understand who you've been talking to." It took Renata Diaz 11 minutes to arrive, and Eleanor used none of them to gloat. That is worth saying plainly, because it is the part that separates this story from 1,000 cheaper ones. In the 11 minutes between the phone call and the sound of heels on the loading dock, Eleanor Mercer did not lord anything over anyone. She crossed the hallway to Marcus Bell, who was still standing there with the shame of the morning all over him, and she crushed her femme, femme, Sam. Front of the staff, easing down to the boy's eye level the way you do for someone you want to be sure can hear you. And she picked up the folded $20 bill that had fallen out of his turned-out pocket and pressed it back into his hand. "This is yours," she said. "You earned it carrying a stranger's bags up 4 flights. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like a thief for being thanked. Put it away." And to Ruth, she said, "Sit down, please. Use the stool. If anyone in this building ever tells you again that you don't get to sit, you send them to me." She did these small things first, before the large ones, and the staff watched her do them, and they understood, before they understood anything else, what kind of owner had just walked in the back door of their lives. Then the gray door opened, and Renata Diaz came through it in a charcoal suit that actually fit the room, carrying a leather portfolio thick as a brick, and behind her came 2 more people with the unmistakable bearing of lawyers, and the temperature of the hallway dropped 10 degrees. "Chairman," Renata said, and inclined her head, and the single word landed on Vincent Crandall like a roof. "Chairman." "I'd like you to meet our general manager," Eleanor said dryly. "Vincent Crandall. He's been explaining his vision for the property. Vincent, this is Renata Diaz, the chief of staff of Halcyon Atlas. You'll recognize the name of the company. You were just telling Mr. Ashbourne how much they're going to love you." She straightened her old gray coat. "I'm Eleanor Mercer. I founded Halcyon Atlas 35 years ago. At 9 o'clock this morning, my company completed its purchase of Ashbourne Hospitality Group, all 42 properties, this one first among them, which means that at the moment you told your security guard to watch the silver around me. Mr. Crandall, you were already technically watching the silver around your employer." She let the sentence finish landing. "I don't expect you to believe me on my word. You strike me as a man who only believes paper. Renata brought paper." What followed was not a tirade. Eleanor Mercer had learned long ago that the most devastating thing in any room is not anger. It is documentation, read aloud, slowly, in a calm voice, by someone who has nothing left to prove. Renata opened the portfolio on the lid of the closed dumpster. There was a certain justice in using it as a table, and she laid out the mechanism of the morning piece by piece, the way you lay out the cards of a hand that has already won. The first document was the closing confirmation, wire received 9:02 a.m. the 14th of April. Halcyon Atlas Group, sole owner, Ashbourne Hospitality Group and all subsidiaries. Charles Ashbourne, standing very still by his abandoned sherry, did not dispute it. He had signed it himself. The second was thicker, and it was the reason Eleanor had come in person, and the reason she had let the morning play out exactly as it did. During the due diligence review of the acquisition, the months of quiet reading that no one at the hotel had known was happening, Halcyon's team had flagged the Ashbourne's flagship for a pattern. Not a rumor. A pattern. The kind that leaves paper. There had been, in the prior 4 years, 14 formal complaints filed against the property for discriminatory treatment of guests and applicants. Guests asked to use the service entrance. Applicants told the position was filled and then watched as it was offered to someone else, a black physician and her husband, in town for a conference, directed to the freight elevator while a white couple behind them was walked to the suite. 11 of those 14 complaints named one manager by initials. The 12th had become a lawsuit. The hotel had settled it 18 months ago for $220,000 and a non-disclosure agreement, paid quietly out of an account Charles Ashbourne had apparently never looked at closely enough to wonder about. The settlement file named Vincent Crandall directly. "You knew," Eleanor said to Charles, not cruelly, almost gently. "Or you arranged very carefully not to know, which a court treats the same way. It's all right. You're not the one I came for." The third document was the one that closed every door. It was an internal memorandum, 2 pages, on hotel letterhead, written and circulated by Vincent Crandall to his front desk and concierge staff 14 months earlier. Renata read 3 lines of it aloud, and they were Crandall's own words, and they were worse on paper than they had been in the hallway. "Lobby presentation is our most valuable asset. Staff should use discretion in directing walk-ins and visitors whose appearance is inconsistent with our guest profile toward the Marlow Street entrance. We are an aspirational brand. Our public spaces should reflect our clientele, not our applicant pool." He had signed it. He had been so proud of it, he had put it in writing. "You wrote your own cause for termination," Eleanor said, 14 months ago. "I didn't have to do anything this morning except wear an old coat and let you be exactly who you've decided to be." She looked at him steadily. "I want you to understand that I am not firing you because you hurt my feelings. My feelings are not the property of this company. I am terminating your employment for cause because you have exposed this hotel to 14 complaints and 1 settled lawsuit, because you put a discriminatory directive in writing, because you instructed staff to humiliate guests and applicants based on their appearance, and because you did all of it again in front of 40 witnesses an hour after I bought the building. There is no version of employment law in this country that protects what is in this file. You know that. You're the kind of man who reads the fine print on everyone but himself." And here Vincent Crandall did the last desperate thing, the thing the cornered always do. He tried to make it her fault. "This is a setup," he said, and his voice cracked down the middle. You came in here in disguise. You tricked me. You let me. That's entrapment. You can't build a termination on a stunt. I'll have a lawyer. I'll have 10 lawyers. You can't fire a man for using professional judgment, and you can't use some costume you put on to manufacture." "Mr. Crandall," Eleanor's voice did not rise. It dropped. "I didn't ask you to write that memo. I didn't ask you to settle a lawsuit. I didn't ask you to tell a guard to watch the silver, or to make a 19-year-old empty his pockets onto the floor, or to tell a man who used to own this hotel that you were going to fire a 71-year-old woman for the crime of having a bad knee. I didn't manufacture any of it. I just declined to stop you." She closed the portfolio. "You keep saying I tricked you. I want you to hear yourself. You're telling a room full of people that the only reason you treated me like garbage is that I didn't warn you I was rich. That isn't a defense, Vincent. That's the whole confession." The hallway was silent, except for the hum of the vending machine. "I want to pause here, one last time, right at the edge of it, because this is the moment the whole story has been walking toward. In a few seconds, you are going to hear a powerful woman do the thing the powerless dream of doing, and almost never can. But before she does, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, to yourself and in the comments. If you believe, really believe, all the way down, that no human being should ever have respect rationed out to them based on the coat they're wearing, the car they drove, the neighborhood they came from, or the color of the face they were born with, then type 3 words for me right now. Type respect is earned. Not given by the rich to the poor, like a coin. Earned by how you treat the person who can do nothing for you. Type it, and then watch what a woman who learned that lesson the hard way does with the power it took her 40 years to win." Eleanor turned to Renata. "Vincent Crandall's employment with Ashbourne Hospitality Group is terminated, effective immediately, for documented cause. He'll be paid through today, and not 1 minute past it. He is not to enter any of our 42 properties as an employee again." She paused, and then she did the thing that told you, more than anything else in the whole long morning, exactly who she was. "He'll be escorted out the front, through the lobby, past the chandeliers and the champagne. He spent 9 years deciding who was allowed to walk through the front of this hotel. He can walk through it one last time himself, on his own feet, with his dignity intact, because I am not going to send him around back. I'm not going to do to him what was done to me. That's the difference between us, and I'd like him to feel it the whole length of that lobby. It was the cleanest cut imaginable. She had every reason and every right to drag him through the loading dock in the rain. She chose the front door. She let him keep the one thing he had spent the morning stealing from everyone else, and in choosing to, she made the loss of his job look like the smaller half of what he was losing. Crandall stood there a moment longer, and you could watch the 9 years come off him like a coat. Then he looked at Eleanor, really looked for the first time at the woman instead of the coat, and something crossed his face that might, in a better man, have grown up someday into shame. He started. Don't. Eleanor said it quietly. Don't apologize to me. I'm not the one who needed it from you, and you don't mean it yet. And a sorry you don't mean is just one more thing taken from the people you've already taken enough from. She nodded. Toward Marcus. Toward Ruth. Toward the line cook in his doorway. Toward the whole gathered back hallway of people he had stepped on for 9 years. If the day ever comes that you mean it, you'll know who to find. It won't be me. And she turned away from him, which was the final and most complete dismissal of all, because she did it without anger, the way you turn away from a thing that has simply stopped being your concern. Todd, the security guard, looked at his former boss and looked at the woman who now signed his check and made the only smart decision available to him. Mr. Crandall, he said, front doors this way, sir. And he walked Vincent Crandall out through the lobby, past the warm champagne and the cold chandeliers, the whole long, humiliating length of the room he had ruled, while the staff who had feared him watched through the service hall doorway, not cheering. Eleanor would not have allowed cheering, and somehow they all knew it, just watching, in a silence that was its own kind of verdict. When he was gone, Eleanor turned to the people who remained. To Charles Ashbourne, gray and shrunken by his dumpster, she was brief and not unkind. The family name would come down from over the door, the past would be looked into, but he had sold in good faith, and she had no interest in pursuing a sad man for the sins he'd paid someone else to commit. To the staff, she was something they had never had from the people who employed them. She was clear. No one in this hallway is being cleaned out, she said. I heard what he planned. The opposite is going to happen. She found Deshawn in his doorway. You're being shorted 40 cases of water a week, and someone's pocketing the difference. I want you to write down everything you've noticed back here that no one would listen to, because you're the people who actually know how this building runs, and starting today, somebody is finally going to listen. She found Marcus. You're not a bellhop anymore, not unless you want to be. You're in the management training program, the real one, the one Crandall would never have let a kid from Roxbury near. You'll start at the front desk. The front. And she said it looking him dead in the eye, so he'd know which front she meant. And then she went to Ruth Daniels, who was sitting on her stool with the brass key still clutched in her hand, crying the quiet way the old cry. And Eleanor knelt down in front of her one more time, and the two women who had met across a kitchen 41 years ago held on to each other in a service hallway that neither of them would ever have to be ashamed of again. 5 months later, in the second week of September, the gray door on Marlowe Street was gone. Where it had stood, behind where the dumpsters used to be, the dumpsters having been moved around the far corner where they belonged, there was now a wide entrance of glass and warm oak and a canopy, and good light spilling out onto a sidewalk that had been scrubbed and planted with 2 young maple trees. The sign above it no longer said staff and deliveries only. It said, in clean brass letters, The Open Door, a program of the Ashbourne. And beneath that, smaller, the line that Eleanor had written herself and refused to let anyone soften. Everyone who works here came through this door. So will everyone who is welcome here. It was a school of a kind, a hospitality academy, the first of what Eleanor intended to be many, built into the ground floor of the hotel where the back of house had once hidden its people away. It took 30 young men and women at a time. Kids from Roxbury and Dorchester and Mattapan, kids from the neighborhoods that the city's grand hotels had always been happy to staff and never to seat, and it paid them while they learned every department, front to back, kitchen to suite, to ledger, on the theory that a person who understands a building from the basement up can do anything with it, including own it someday. Eleanor knew that theory was true. She was standing proof of it, in a new coat now, though she'd kept the old gray one in a closet on the 39th floor and would never throw it away. The week before the first class arrived, she had done one last thing to the entrance, quietly, after the workers had gone home. Just inside the new oak doors, set into the wall at the height where a person walks in, she had mounted a small glass case, lit from within, and inside the case, on a square of dark cloth, hung a single brass key on a frayed red ribbon gone the color of old brick. Beneath it was a brass plate, and the plate did not explain the key, because the people who needed to understand it would, and the rest could simply wonder. It said only, "You don't wait outside in the cold for someone to decide you're allowed in. You let yourself in." Given to a frightened girl in this building, 1985. Ruth Daniels had cried when she saw it, and then she had laughed, and then she had said the thing that Eleanor would carry for the rest of her own life the way she'd carried the key. "I gave you one, and look, now you've made 1,000. Because that was the other thing. On the first morning of every new class, it was Ruth Daniels, 72 now, with a title that finally matched the 41 years. Director of Welcome, a job Eleanor had invented for exactly one person on earth, who stood at the new oak doors and handed each arriving student a brass key on a red ribbon. They were ordinary keys. They opened the locker rooms, the staff doors, the rooms each student would learn to clean, and then to manage, and then, some of them, to own. But Ruth folded each one into a young palm, the same way she had folded the first one in 1985, and she said the same words, and you could watch the words land. Watch a nervous 19-year-old from Crawford Street or Blue Hill Avenue hear, maybe for the first time in their life, that there was a door in this world that was theirs to open and no one's to deny them. Eleanor had been wrong all those years about one small thing. She had carried the key, thinking she would one day return it. She understood now that you don't return a thing like that. You copy it. You hand it on. You make 1,000. Marcus Bell was 20 now, and he no longer kept his shoes too clean out of fear. He kept them clean out of pride, which is a different thing entirely, and you could see the difference in how he stood. He had finished the first management track at the top of his cohort. He worked the front desk of the Ashbourne, the front, the real front, under the chandeliers, and he had a way with the difficult guests that the staff had started to talk about, a patience that came, Eleanor suspected, from having once stood on the wrong side of a man's contempt and decided never to hand that feeling to another living soul. The week before, an elderly couple in travel-worn clothes had come through the brass revolving doors looking lost and a little embarrassed, the kind of guests the Ashbourne of a year ago would have quietly steered toward the cheaper rooms or the side street. Marcus had come around the desk to meet them. He had walked them to the best available suite at the standard rate, carried their bags himself, and told them, when the woman apologized for not being dressed for a place like this, the thing he'd been told on a steel bench by a woman in a gray coat. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't belong somewhere you've every right to be. He had no idea Eleanor was standing across the lobby when he said it. She did not tell him. Some lessons you only know took root when you see them bloom in someone else's hands. As for Vincent Crandall, and people always want to know, so I'll tell you plainly, without dressing it up the way he used to dress up his lobby, he did not go to prison. He had broken no law that carries a cell. He lost the thing he had built his whole self upon, which was the standing to look down on other people from behind a desk in a beautiful room. The settled lawsuit and the memorandum in his own hand followed him. The luxury world is small, and it whispers, and no five-star property in the city would put his certain kind of face at its front desk after that. The last anyone heard, he was managing a budget motel off a highway. Changed 2 states away, checking in tired travelers under fluorescent lights at 3 in the morning, watching people come and go through a single glass door that led, for everyone alike, to the same plain rooms. Maybe that taught him something. Maybe it didn't. Eleanor never asked, and she never gloated, and she never once spoke his name again after that morning, because she had learned long ago that the people who wrong you do not deserve to keep living in your head rent-free. The best revenge was never going to be his ruin. The best revenge was the 1,000 keys. She came back to the hotel on the first Tuesday of every month, always unannounced, always early, always. And the staff teased her for it now, gently, the way you tease someone you love, in some plain coat that made the new doorman who hadn't yet learned the story do a double take. She would walk the floor as a stranger for an hour, front to back, top to bottom, listening to how the house treated the person it thought could do nothing for it. The house had changed. She could feel it, the way you feel a fever break. And once, on one of those quiet early mornings, she let herself out the new oak doors onto Marlowe Street, alone, before the city was fully awake. And she stood for a while where the gray door used to be, where an 18-year-old girl had once emptied her bag onto the wet concrete in the rain to prove she was not a thief, where the same girl had made herself a promise she had never spoken aloud to a living soul. I told you, at the start, that you would see that promise kept. Here it is. The promise was not that she would get rich, though she did. It was not that she would buy the building, though she did that too. The promise the soaked and shaking girl made to herself at the bus stop in March of 1987 was this: if I ever have the power, no one is going to stand out here in the cold the way I'm standing now. I will build a door that doesn't ask who you are before it lets you in. She had built it. It was right behind her, glowing warm in the gray morning, with a key in a glass case and an old woman's blessing over the threshold, and 1,000 more keys waiting inside for 1,000 more kids who had been told, somewhere, by someone, to go around back. She put her hand in her pocket out of 40 years of habit, and for a moment she was startled to find it empty, before she remembered. The key was in the case now. She didn't need to carry it anymore. She had become it. So here is what this story is really about, and I think some of you have known it since the first minute, because it has happened to you. Somewhere in your life, someone took one look at you, at your age, your clothes, your accent, your color, your hands, the door you came in through, and decided in under 2 seconds who you were and what you were worth. And they were wrong. They are always wrong, the ones who decide that fast, because a human being is not a thing you can read off a coat. The world will keep pointing certain people toward the back entrance. It has always done it, and it is doing it somewhere right now. But here is the truth that woman in the gray coat spent 40 years proving, and that I want you to carry out of here today and keep against your own chest like a key on a ribbon. The door they send you to does not get to decide your worth. Your worth was never theirs to rate. And the most powerful thing you will ever do is not to become cruel back, not to send them around the back the way they sent you, but to outlast them, to build the door you were denied, and to hold it open for the next person they would have turned away. That is not weakness. That is the only kind of strength that lasts. The cruel build walls and call them standards. The strong build doors and call them welcome. So tell me. In the comments, I want you to do 2 things. First, type the words, "Let yourself in," for the door someone once tried to keep you out of, and for the one you're going to open for somebody else. And second, tell me about the moment someone decided who you were before they knew you, and how you proved them wrong, or how you're still planning to. I read these. We read these together, all of us. This whole room of people the world counted out too soon. If this story reached something in you, share it with one person who has ever been sent around back and needs to hear that the door they were denied can still become the door they build. And then come back, because we are just getting started, and there are a lot more bridges yet to burn. This has been the Burned Bridges Club, where the people they wrote off get the last word, and the quiet ones, in the end, hold the keys.